Outside the Basilica, the faithful have been gathering.
Paul Clarke has a storied 50-year career on the front line of history, reporting war and peace. Most recently, he joined the many thousands from around the world to descend on Vatican City for the funeral of Pope Francis. And I'm delighted that he is joining me for the latest UTV vodcast. Hi, I'm Carol Jordan. Easter Monday saw the passing of Pope Francis. Hailed as a pope for the people, the 88-year-old's death was not unexpected, but it was sudden. Our presenter Paul Clarke travelled with cameraman Tommy Hassan to Rome to cover the funeral, which was held 5 days later. It wasn't Paul's first time covering the story of the death of a pope. 20 years ago, he covered the death of John Paul II, also for UTV. Thanks so much for joining me today, Paul.
Thank you. I feel decidedly uncomfortable. I'll tell you why. I'm more used to asking the questions than answering them, but...
Well, a little bit of role reversal
will
never hurt anybody. So, first of all, Paul, what was it like to be on the ground in Rome during such an auspicious occasion? What were people telling you?
It's an amazing privilege to be able to do the job that I do. I've been doing it now for over 50 years, and I've never lost the enthusiasm that I have for telling stories, and this was another example of that. It is a great, great privilege to be there, particularly at what is a world event. And indeed, as you said, it wasn't my first time. So there was a sense in which I could, if I wished, compare and contrast between a papal funeral 20 years ago and this one in 2025. But there was a great deal of common ground. There was the sense of outpouring, the sense of grief, the sense that so many people, and particularly young people, had travelled from different parts of the world to be there. 20 years ago, I was very conscious that the people from Poland, particularly the young people from Poland, had travelled, and it wasn't that difficult for them to be there because all they had to do was get on a train. But this time, I was very aware of people from Central and South America who would have had to go they'd have had to have an awful more ability or patience in order to get from where they were to arrive in Rome. But the other thing about their being there was that there was a Jubilee event for teenagers, and it had been planned to take place at this particular time. There was talk apparently that they might have postponed it because of the death of the Pope, but in the end they decided to go ahead with that. And that being the case, these people who had come as pilgrims were there also as mourners.
And what were people telling you about what the Pope meant to them? What sort of a man did they think he was? What sort of a leader did they think he was?
They were saying different things, and it all depended on who you were talking to. For example, when I arrived in Rome, whenever I checked into the hotel, the gentleman at reception knew why we were there, and he said that the heart of his stomach had a hole in it. Or there was the bottom of his stomach had a hole in it, he was saying. And I know exactly what he meant. And he was explaining to me that even though the Pope was a worldwide leader, he was also the Bishop of Rome. And so you had this sense that there was somebody very much on the ground who felt that sense of loss. But then others that I had spoken to would be able to tell me about, for example, their own culture and what death meant to them. And I remember talking to a priest who said that, all of us, we know what it's like to lose a father in death. Well, guess what? That's what it's like for us. The Pope was the head of the church, but he was also our father. And so he was able to extend it from the church to the individual and bring it down to the family. And we've all had that sort of loss. And so he explained it in a beautiful way. He was from Fermanagh, so he told us that, the Irish do death, and they do death very well. And he wasn't saying it in any pejorative way. He was just saying it like it is. And he could say it with a beautiful rural Fermanagh accent. And I'm sure that everybody could have connected with that. Not just people who were mourning the death of the Pope, Catholics, but anybody and everybody who had to face up to the death of a loved one.
One thing that's, I think, struck a lot of us, on this side of the divide when you're in the newsroom, was the fact that on Easter Sunday, we had seen the Pope out on the balcony and, in fact, right in with the people. And in my introduction, I called him a Pope of the people. And it seems there was another lovely anecdote about how he was calling the church in Gaza, the only Catholic church in Gaza, every evening. He was really seen as a man who could connect very well with his followers, with, Catholics, and actually with people from all parts of the world. He was really a galvanizing force, wasn't he?
As you said, it was not a surprise in the end that he died, but a shock, given that he had been in the Vatican Square on Easter Sunday. But then on Easter Monday morning, he was pronounced dead. And I was wondering to myself, and I have no way of backing this up, but there were other people who said much the same. He wanted to be there for the resurrection, for the day of the resurrection of Christ, the holiest day, the highest day in the Christian calendar. And he did that. And I think that afterwards he could make his peace with God, and he had achieved his mission. But beyond that, here was somebody who connected with people in so many different ways. You mentioned there the church in Gaza. The Thursday before he died, which was Holy Thursday, he went to one of the prisons in Rome. And he couldn't physically do it this year, but every year since he was Pope, he washed the feet of 12 prisoners. And symbolically, somebody else had to do it this year, and he was lamenting the fact that he couldn't physically do it, but he was there. And that was the extent to which he reached out beyond the core Catholics, you might say, because here were people on the fringes, and he could relate very much to what Jesus did whenever he walked this earth, because what he was doing was he was connecting with the people who felt abandoned. For example, people who were in second relationships, people who were gay. He reached out to them to the extent that very traditional Catholics were at times saying, is the Pope really a Catholic? And he could stand over what he was doing because he said, I'm just doing what Jesus would do. And that was what he did as Pope. Even when he would have been traveling in Italy, people would have been in towns and villages watching for the cavalcade to come through. He traveled in a very, very ordinary car.
A Skoda, no less.
But he stopped. Yeah. And he got out because people would have their children there and he would bless them. And I was just very taken by some of the images. And none of this was ever contrived. Sometimes you come across people, I'm doing this for show, I'm doing this because I can. But he wasn't. And he really was the humble man that so many people said he was. Now, I never met him. I'd seen him at close quarters, particularly when he became Pope Francis, because I was in the Vatican that day, and when he visited Ireland in 2018. And one of the things that he did try to do was to face up to the fact that the Catholic Church was in a mess whenever it came to clerical abuse. And people will say he never got that sorted. But he did move in that direction. And obviously the next Pope is going to have to continue in that journey.
We often, we often talk about the demise of the Church and the fact that, it has had all these scandals. And, you were there 20 years ago in Rome when John Paul II died. Clearly, as we were talking about, you were there just last week. Did you have any palpable sort of sense that the Church is on the wane? Do you think that is a true and accurate portrayal of where the Catholic Church lies at the moment?
In fact, the opposite. And I'll tell you why. In Rome in 2005, the young people from particularly Poland, but other countries in Europe, they descended and they had no accommodation. They slept in doorways. The weather in Rome at this time of year is mild anyway, so it was no big deal. But they just felt they had to come. And I was aware of that. I was aware of the numbers of young people who were there. And I was aware of that again this time. And yes, I've heard the same stories, the Church is dying. But whenever it comes to something like this, the faithful do gather. And one of the things that occurred to me, particularly during the Mass on Saturday, and because I was with the people, if you know what I mean, I couldn't see very much of what was going on the altar. I couldn't see the great and the good who were there, but I was among the ordinary people, so many of them young people, and they weren't there as spectators, but they were taking part. I saw them kneeling. I saw them praying. And by the way, they weren't kneeling on kneelers. They were kneeling on the cobbles, painful enough, and they were praying. And they were taking communion. And that's what it meant to them. And I was very, very moved by that. I mean, yes, it's my job to tell a story, but actually you can connect with people, because personally I have a faith myself, and I could try in some way to understand what it was that they were going through at that time.
You say that you're there to tell a story. Mm-hmm. It's quite, religion is a very personal and for some people a very deep-ridden thing. It's very dear and close to their heart. How do you as a journalist make sure that you get the tone right when you're covering such an event?
Wow, I don't think you can ever set out to try and get the tone right. I think what happens is years of experience. And I think that essentially, yes, I am a storyteller, but I think that it has to be in the vein of where you are and the circumstances that have brought you to this particular point. And I can't turn around and say I set out to do it this way, that way, or the other. But you rely on instinct and the fact that you have done stories of grief before, stories of this nature before as well. So you can't have an agenda. I just went with an open page, an open book, so to speak, and wrote what I saw and trusted my own instinct and my own judgment to get it right.
As a journalist, you started this conversation by saying it was a privilege for you to be on the ground for this historical event. How important is it to you as a storyteller, as a journalist, to be able to travel to events like this and to be able to bring them to the wider audience?
It is an immense privilege. It's also frightening, because I remember saying to my wife before I left on the early hours of Easter Tuesday morning to fly to Rome, I told my wife I was afraid, and I was, because I wasn't sure what awaited me, and I wasn't sure how I was going to handle it as well, because
massive responsibility.
It was a standing start, and we hit the ground running, and we were very lucky. We managed to make air at 6 o'clock. There was an expectation that we mightn't, and that was if the flight had been delayed or anything like that. So essentially, all the way through the journey, I had to be open. I had to be a bit like a sponge and just take it all in and hope that whenever I squeezed the sponge, that everything came out in an order that made sense. And I suppose you might say at one level, I went as an empty vessel, and I was only filled whenever I got there, saw what I saw, wrote what I wrote, and then spoke what I spoke.
Excellent. Now, looking ahead, obviously the conclave is going to begin in the next week or so. Who are the front runners to become the next pope, and what do you think the sort of main challenges are going to be for them?
Everybody
for that lucky person.
Everybody is saying, is it lucky to be the pope? That's the other thing. But many people will always say, and is it a beauty contest?
Yeah.
The talk is that Paddy Power, for example, has betting odds on who will be the next pope. None of us can know with any certainty at all. I mean, it's been said, for example, that the next pope, the expectation is it'll be an Italian. Why? Because the last Italian pope was Pope John Paul I. Since then, we've had a Polish pope, we've had a German pope, and an Argentinian. So there's a body there that says, well, actually, let's have an Italian back in the Vatican. But then there are others who will say, well, Pope Francis has made cardinals out of more than half of the College of Cardinals. So they would be people who would be in his own image. In that sense, the expectation is that whoever would be elected next would want to continue with the reforming nature of the papacy. But none of us can know that with any certainty. There's another cardinal, he's 64, he's the cardinal of the Philippines, and there's an expectation that he might be too young. And the reason for that is John Paul II became Pope when he was 59. He died whenever he was in his middle 80s. And so he had a long time to put his stamp on the throne of St. Peter. But at the same time, there would have been other cardinals who might have thought, well, something, I would like to have the opportunity to be Pope sometime. So I'm wondering whether or not at this stage, the next Pope would be somebody in the same vintage as Francis was whenever he became Pope. He was 75. And so we will not know, and I know that there's always politicking. I've seen the movie, Conclave, but beyond that, I think that we have to rely on the cardinals to do as they must, and that is to feel that they are responding to the Word and the Spirit of God. And the other thing is too, apparently, and I can't say this with any certainty because it's closed to the outside world, but nobody turns around and says, I'm a cardinal, I think I should be Pope. They are very humble.
Okay, well, that's good to know, but I think it's a massive challenge for anyone, and to be taking it on.
And who would want it?
Exactly, to be taking it on later in life is a massive challenge. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Paul. That's it from this edition of the UTV Vodcast. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and remember you can always catch us on ITVX. Just search for UTV News. Until next time, goodbye.